Hello my friends, let's talk about Dungeons & Dragons in a little segment that I've decided to start calling Dungeon Hermit. Now, this episode is just going to be me talking about a particular pet peeve that I have with the game, and in all, is this pet peeve going to matter? No, not really. Is it important to the quality of the game or whether or not you have fun with it? No, not even a little bit. But it is something that has kind of always irked me the wrong way, and I want to talk about it a little bit because I think some other people, maybe I'm the only one, will commiserate with it. And that's the way that Dungeons & Dragons approaches the idea of race or humanoids. And before I get into my pet peeve, I do want to at least take a chance to sort of laud them, to talk about the positive ways that Dungeons & Dragons has attempted to make sure that real-life human cultures are represented and respected as distinct, while also not being entirely separated from everything else. And the way that they mostly did that was under the human player race. They went through a very big extent of effort to sort of capture everything that humanity is about in a very vague, abstract way. And part of that is that they had this section of human names and ethnicities, whereas in other player race sections, it's usually a quick blurb about that race's culture and the sort of names that they would have. But in the human section, it's names and ethnicities. And it goes into all the different cultures, fantasy cultures of the Dungeons & Dragons world. And pretty much all of them are sort of broad spectrum description of cultures that we have in the real world. So I'm just going to go through those real quick to give you an idea of the kind of effort that Dungeons & Dragons, or that Wizards of the Coast went through for 5th edition to be as inclusive as possible, before I start giving my nitpicks and saying why I feel that the way that they handle the idea of race is a little bit uncomfortable to me. So under the human names and ethnicities section, they have this list, the first one being the Kalashite, or described as shorter and slighter in build than most other humans. Kalashites have dusky brown skin, hair, and eyes. They are found primarily in southwest Faerun. And of course the description of where are they found, what is Faerun. These are things for people who are very much into the canon Dungeons & Dragons lore and mythos. And I've been finding that as Dungeons & Dragons has gotten more popular, less and less people are actually aware of or knowledgeable about that shared lore, that shared experience of the stories. I know I lack a lot of knowledge when it comes to the actual story and setting of Dungeons & Dragons, because pretty much every game I've ever played has been in a homebrew campaign, a homebrewed unique world that doesn't share its rules, its commonalities, or political cultures with what's been established in Dungeons & Dragons media. The next one is the Chondathan. They are slender, tawny-skinned folk with brown hair that ranges from almost blonde to almost black. Most are tall and have green or brown eyes, but these traits are hardly universal. Humans of Chondathan descent dominate the central lands of Faerun around the Inner Sea. Next is Damaran. Found primarily in the northwest of Faerun, Damarans are a moderate height and build, with skin hues ranging from tawny to fair. Their hair is usually brown or black, and their eye color varies widely though brown is most common. Illuskins are tall, fair-skinned folk with blue or steely gray eyes. Most have raven black hair, but those who inhabit the extreme northwest have blonde, red, or light brown hair. The Mulan dominated in the eastern and southeastern shores of the Inner Sea. The Mulan are generally tall, slim, and amber-skinned with eyes of hazel or brown. Their hair ranges from black or dark brown, but in the lands where the Mulan are most prominent, nobles and many other Mulan shave off all of their hair. The Rashemi, most often found east of the Inner Sea and often intermingled with the Mulan, Rashemis tend to be short, stout, and muscular. They usually have have dusky skin, dark eyes, and thick black hair. The Sho are the most numerous and powerful ethnic group in Kara-Tur, far to the east of Faerun. They are yellowish-browns in hue, with black hair and dark eyes. Sho surnames are usually presented before the given name. Tetherian, widespread among the entire Sword Coast as the western edge of Faerun. Tetherians are medium build and height, with dusky skin that tends to grow fairer the far north they dwell. Tetherians primarily use Chondathan names. The Turami, native to the southern shore of the Inner Sea, the Turami people are generally tall and muscular, with dark mahogany skin, curly black hair, and dark eyes. So, if you can see that from those descriptions, there's a sort of pattern in that they have this main location of an inner sea, and they describe all of these cultures in relation to where they would lie, using that inner sea as the center compass of a map. In particular, Mulan, the Rashemi, and the Sho, they're trying to point to Chinese cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, Japanese cultures, while also mixing them in with other cultures that surround them to create something that is a little more broad, not very specifically, this is that culture from the real world. They had references to a little bit more ideas of the Norse, a little bit more idea of the Saxons, African, like really it's, if you take it in broad spectrum, the way that, say, United States racialization takes races to mean, then it's kind of doing the same thing, but attempting to be more inclusive by describing the wide variety that every single one of these groups can have, and how any given expression will count as part of that culture. So I really appreciate these sorts of efforts that were taken in order to be inclusive and intersectional with their understanding of culture when it comes to the human player race. I think where the setting and the world building starts to break down is with the concept of the humanoid, which is a class. It is a category of monster, which just is a generic term for enemy, target, non-player NPC with a stat block used in the game. And the sort of creatures that come under the category of humanoid are extremely varied. I'm going to bring up a list here, starting just from the top. I'm on the fandom wiki at this point, so there's going to be a couple repeats if it's like elf versus other elf. But we have the Arakocra, which are bird people. We have the Aasimar, which are angels. Air Ganassi, and all the Ganassi in general, are humans who had a child with a genie, and the result was a Ganassi. Aquatic elves, all of the elves. Avariel, which are these sort of angel harpy mixes. Alright, we also have bugbears, which are classic Dungeons & Dragons creatures, which are kind of just like a very hairy goblin. Bullywugs, which are these little frogs that have learned to stand up on their hind legs and can hold spears. We have gnomes, we have Scions, Darrows, Corby, Dragonborn, Drow, which are dark elves, Duergar, which are dark dwarves, Earth Ganassi elf, Firbolgs, which are false giants, so some kind of, I'm not exactly sure what culture the Firbolg concept comes from, though I do think it does. Fire Ganassi, Fire Newts, which are literally just newts that are standing upright that can hold weapons. We have the Flind, Gnome, Halflings, the Gif, the Gith and the Gith, two different things. The Knoll, Goblins, the Grimlock, the Grung, Half-Dragon, and then there are all the half-races, which I'll get into differently. Half-Dragon, Half-Drow, Half-Elf, Half-Orc, the Halfling, which is not actually half of anything, they're just short. Hobgoblins, of course, humans are humanoid. Also, Jackalwares, which are not a human that has become a werewolf but of a jackal, but they're jackals that can transform into humans, and as well as a sort of in-between werewolf-like state. Kenku, which are crow people, Koalith, which are these like sort of green, spiny, grassy ogres, kobolds, which are little dragon dogs that are human-shaped, Kuatoa, which are fish people that live underwater and are Cthulhu mythos style, able to create gods out of their beliefs in gods. Lava Child, I guess you can figure out what a Lava Child is. Lightfoot Halfling, it's just a kind of halfling. Lizard King and Lizard Folk, Lokathath, Matron Mother, Measles, Merfolk, Mongrel Folk, general terms for different kinds of fish people, and I guess you can think of mongrel folk as Harry Potter dobbies, that sort of thing. And we have the Nilbolg, the Orc, the Orug, and Orugs are like bigger, different orcs. The Quaggoth, of all things, is a humanoid, and that's like a Wendigo. It's like a Yeti. It's just this really fuzzy, hunched-over creature that runs around. It doesn't really even speak languages. We have the Sahuagin, Sea Spawn, Shadarkai, which are elves. We have Skulks, which are kind of like elves, but they turn invisible whenever they want. Star Elves, Sun Elves, lots of elves. The Tabaxi, which are cat people, like the Khajiit race from the Elder Scrolls. Three King, which are giant grasshoppers, praying mantis, so insect people. Tieflings, which are demon-like humanoids that are, supposedly, depending on which one you want to go with, the offspring of a demon and a person, or is something more like a unique race to one of their settings of the Nine Hells, or whichever one you want to use. The Tortle, giant turtle people. The Triton, which is another kind of merfolk, only, prettier. Troglodyte, which are actually one of my favorite creatures to use for the early game, but they're like really scaly, not quite mud crabs, but something like that. The Erd, the Verdin, the Werebat, all were creatures are humans that have the ability to turn into these things or stuck as these things, including boar, rat, raven, tiger, and wolf, of course. The thing I can't pronounce, Xvarts, are humanoids, and they are these really tiny creatures with heads that are as big as the rest of their body. I really never want to use one of those in my game. They are kind of gross. The Yuan-Ti, which are these snake-human hybrids or snake-cursed humans. And then finally the Zorth. This one I forget. Oh no, the Zorth are just a title for one of the Githzerai races. Githzerai are basically like the native peoples of, I believe, the astral plane. And then they, come to the material plane and set themselves up there. So, generally, as you can see, a lot of different creatures that have almost nothing in common have this category of being humanoid. And this actually ends up being important to the game because some spells or some actions specify that they work on humanoids, but not other classes of creature, or the other way around, though none come to mind that only work on non-humanoids. Maybe some that work specifically well on different categories, like demon, or something like that. But the reason that this is particularly bothersome is the way in which it is handled, in that every one of these categories that is determined as humanoid shares a very broad and simplified, this is just how they are, way of describing some other species. And it is really in that distinction, or that lack of distinction between what is a race and what is a species, that my little issue with the presentation of races in Dungeons & Dragons starts to crop up. So if you want to talk scientifically, A species is basically determined by the ability for that sort of creature to reproduce effectively with other kinds of that creature, which, if I'm remembering my biology right. So when you think about dogs, dogs come in so many vastly different shapes and varieties, different breeds that humanity has developed over time through controlling our selective breeding of these animals over millennia. And the result is that we have all these different dogs that we put in different categories for what they're good at, what they're not good at, how they're different. But dogs of all different kinds are still viable, meaning they can reproduce with any other dog of its species. If a Chihuahua were to mate with a pit bull, you would still get a dog. It would be a pit bull Chihuahua mix. A Chihuahua is not unviable with a pit bull. And so that, in the scientific perspective, maintains even this vast disparity of expression in dog genetics as a single species. Now, let's say you'll say, oh, but I can question that because lions and tigers can reproduce and make a living creature. The viability comes in that the creature that is produced also has to be able to reproduce with another creature to make the line continue. So when say a liger or a tigon, a mixture of a lion and tiger depending on who the mother is born because of, scientists at zoos just wanting to see if it'll work, or if they're being kept in the same enclosure and they happen to start mating, the result is that if the offspring lives, then it will also not have the ability to reproduce itself. It doesn't have the genetics necessary to produce reproductive cells. They can't produce sperm or egg, and often are subject to a number of difficulties in terms of their health. I think in particular ligers suffer from a small degree of gigantism. They grow too big. They don't stop growing when they should, and so it's difficult for them to eat enough food and to move around as much as they should. But I'm trying to remember facts about biology that I learned at least a decade ago at this point, so don't take my word on any of it. When we take that into consideration, that a species, in other words, the term that Dungeons & Dragons is trying to get at when it says race, is also supposed to be considered interlocked with all of the other humanoids that the game has created. And the main way that you can see that demonstrated is in all of the half-something races, the half races that the player can play or encounter in the game. Mainly the half-orc, the half-elf, there was another half-something in there, but even like the Ganassi is half-genie, half-human. The Aasimar are half-angel, half-human. The demons, the tieflings, half-demon, half-human. So even non-human creatures can create human or humanoid offspring that are of the same species in Dungeons & Dragons world building. The reason this bothers me is because all of the other player races, all of the other races of Dungeons & Dragons are essentially treated as a monolith, as a single entity with a unified culture that is defined by their genetics. Let me share with you a little story about my time working as a Lyft and Uber driver. I had, a routine pickup, as they all are at the start, and it was this gentleman, I kid you not, he was blind, he was very angry, just in general, with his wife as he was coming out to the car, and throughout the entire ride, he was preaching to me about the ideas of eugenics And if you don't know what eugenics are, it's essentially selective breeding, but with humans. But it is ultimately just racial culling, the pseudo-scientific idea of putting certain features of a different race, particularly white people, as being the most valuable features, all the best characteristics, and then trying to select for those characteristics when humanity has children, and particularly trying to get the government to institute programs that will determine who people can start families and have children with. And the guy, I kid you not, tried to argue to me, a very obviously multiracial, dark-skinned man, which he couldn't see because he was blind, in both actual reality and in this case metaphorically, that the language of Spanish, just Spanish, was a genetically predetermined ability, that the DNA made you speak Spanish. As if no one has ever learned Spanish. As if children don't learn Spanish through growing up and being in that culture. As if a child could grow up completely distinct from the Spanish language and still know Spanish because DNA contains language that we use in our day-to-day life. This is the kind of very casual and ignorant degree to which different bigotries come up with myths, come up with nonsense ideas to explain their positions, their beliefs of superiority. And the reason that particular experience informs my experience with Dungeons and Dragons is that every playable race and every humanoid is treated as though its genetic difference, the fact that it is a separate species, gives it all of these different features, different physical abilities that are hard-locked in the statistics, and each one of these humanoid category creatures, including the player races, has a language that is specific to that player race. For humans, the language is just common. But, you know, there is a halfling language, there is an orc language, a dwarf language, an elf language. Every species, every one of these player races are treated as a separate, distinct species with a language inherent to their bodies. And that is the part that doesn't sit well with me. That even though it is inclusive, it treats every single one of these races as a separate species, rather than as a different culture, a different expression of what the game is attempting to say, of what the lore of the game is attempting to say, is one unified community, given that all of these different races are able to still form families and have children together, which is why there are half-orcs and half-elves, which is why there are the Ganassi and the Aasimar and the Tieflings, is that there is this weird disparity between saying these things are absolutely separate, determined by a genetic species-level difference, and then at the same time saying, oh no, but they are all the same thing, we're just treating them as separate. And so that's the thing that really just gives me a little twinge of frustration, in that I see the work that Dungeons & Dragons has done, particularly to make sure cultures are represented and respected, and that no particular people are being left out, in a way that is still respecting all the differences of each and every one of those cultures, of the people actually living in those cultures. But then at the same time, their concept of what makes a race is very much tied to this genetic species difference, and they can't seem to, or at least they haven't made a decision on if these creatures, if these humanoids, this category of monster, which again is a generic catch-all term for the game, not a, not a moral statement. They just haven't come to a solid idea on what that is supposed to be. And that feeling that this player race is being treated as a different species, even though there is not a species difference according to the game, means that the game either thinks that different ethnicities are to be treated as different species, or they don't realize that different races do not mean different species. And ultimately, I don't actually think anyone at Wizards of the Coast thinks that that is the case. But the game itself sort of makes that argument, that a race means different species. And when you apply that to the real world, that, if you even attempt to apply game logic to the real world, which you should not do, that, say, African is a different species to white, even though those categories are problematic in and of themselves, you basically are promoting this underlying cultural assumption of the race myth that, humanity is separated by our biology. And we're not. Nothing in our biology separates different human cultures from uniting. It's social, it's cultural, it's historical, it's emotional. Just having bad experiences from birth that keeps us separated. It's attempting to overcome those things that is the mark of a person who is actually worldly with their sense of citizenship, with their sense of community with other people. There was another experience that I had that was particularly negative when playing Dungeons & Dragons. It was going to a local game shop back in my hometown of Bellevue, Nebraska, and dropping into a game of Dungeons & Dragons with the people that were there. And I wasn't entirely sure what I was getting into, but I had gone in with the assumption that they were playing under the Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League rules. I had created a character that followed those rules. The game shop had advertised that it was doing a Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, and so I was like, okay, great. I don't particularly like doing Adventurers League, but I don't have anyone else to play with at the moment, so I went in. I joined this table that I quickly learned had just implemented a ton of house rules and were just, playing a regular game that didn't have any standardization. A lot of even one of the characters was allowed to play a orc that had been magically manipulated by a wizard to be giant, and gave him a strength score of 25, which is 5 above the maximum, and explained it away by giving him an intelligence of 1. And the character decided, or at least the player, I should say, the player decided that the one thing that he was going to make as his central character trait was how much he hated drow, dark elves. He really, to the point of, my character is someone who, upon seeing a drow of any kind, anywhere, is going to immediately attempt to murder them. And the warlock that I had chosen to play was in fact using the drow player race. Kind of a bit of a conflict there. So it was kind of just a, "Are you a drow? I'm gonna kill you." No, I'm not a drow. Let me lie about myself so that I can feel not threatened in this public space at this table of real people who are pretending to be racist. And that is their source of fun for Dungeons and Dragons. An opportunity to explore the fantasy of being powerful and racist. And it made me so uncomfortable. That entire game was a series of me sitting there as a player character, not getting to make any decisions, but at the same time trying to navigate this social situation where I honestly could not tell if the other people at the table were actually racist or not. And if they were essentially enjoying getting to play at this violent racist narrative in front of me as I was the only dark-skinned person in the building. And it was the most uncomfortable I've ever been playing Dungeons and Dragons. It was the worst experience I've ever had. And like, the guy particularly who was playing this big, powerful, racist orc giant even came into GameStop at the time where I was working, because of course I worked at GameStop, and started up a conversation with me like it was no big thing, like he was seeing an old friend, and talked to me about how their game was going and where it went after that one day that I had dropped in. And it was very odd for me that he was genuinely happy to see me, and very pleasant and respectful, more than most of the other customers that came in around that time. And it was so confusing, because it was so painful to try to socially navigate a space that felt so hostile to the idea of dark skin, because they decided to play a fantasy of racism at their table. And no one had said, maybe that's not a great idea. Or maybe calm it down for the session that the black guy shows up, at least. And so from my experience, I've always had this sort of wariness, I guess a fear, that more people that I encounter playing the game and enjoying the hobby want to take the racial hatreds that are in fact in the Dungeons and Dragons lore and are used by the Dungeons and Dragons fictional material to deconstruct the idea of hating different people, and really just diving into enjoying the hatred and enjoying the fact that they have those biases, rather than using it as an opportunity to explore a character who gets over those biases. And so to a certain extent, the reason I don't like how Dungeons & Dragons has handled this gray space of, a race versus a human versus a humanoid, is that I think it is directly related to the occasional experiences I've had with these sorts of players, and thus creates for me a worry anytime I sit down at a new table of who are these people, and is this a safe situation? And no one should ever feel unsafe playing a game. No one should ever feel unsafe in this institution that is designed to bring people together and forge new friendships with other just as nerdy people, socially awkward people as you. So thanks to that meeting that I had with this guy when he came into my work, I guess I just chalked it up to, this is a very socially awkward scenario, which is not uncommon. And maybe they were just exploring the space because they were trying to understand something that they didn't have the opportunity to actually talk to someone about. And so they were trying to learn through play. That's what I decided to think about that scenario. Obviously, I love this game a lot, and I spend way too much time thinking about the minutiae of how this game represents itself and what it means to be a player of this game and be a part of a community of people who play this game. But on that same night, I accidentally dropped my Sharpie on the front page of the Warlock player class in my player's handbook, and so now I can't help but think about that incident whenever I see this Sharpie mark that I've messed up my book with. It's such a silly little thing. But overall, the point of this really long video is to, I guess, give a warning. To just not, and if you are taking it seriously, if you are taking the idea of races and humanoids as a creature type and species as an idea in this game, to just not take it seriously. It's magic. Everyone can get together with everyone, and that's fine. I really don't think this sort of issue is going to come up all that much unless your group happens to be running a campaign where finding mates and making babies is really centrally important to what everyone in the party wants to do. And in that case, I'm going to say that your group is probably playing the wrong game, and there are a lot of erotic board games out there that will serve your purpose a lot better for what you're trying to get at. But maybe Dungeons & Dragons isn't your baby-making simulator of choice. Point is, I love the game. I've had a lot of experiences with this game, and that was one of them. A thing that has made me uncomfortable in the past, but ultimately I think as long as you have the right perspective of these are fantasy races, and it's weird that I have to say that, because some people don't get to draw the line that the idea of race in a fantasy setting does not actually mean what it means in the real world. That it isn't in fact a separation of species, nor is it a separation of race, nor is it a separation of ethnicity, but just a broad spectrum of interesting and fun ideas that you can mix together as a fantasy setting and have fun with it, rather than, making it a opportunity to explore hostility. But that's all I have to say. Thank you so much. My goodness, this was a really long one to start off, and I'm glad I did it in this format. I hope I put up enough little diagrams and cinematics over in this space, because that was what I was planning, though probably I ended up not using very many because I went on a huge ramble. I do have a few more videos planned. I'm going to try to get more released this month, but I've decided that I'm not going to restrict myself to making Dungeons & Dragons videos in the month of December, because I have a lot of things that I want to talk about regarding the game, particularly with the monk class. I have a lot of videos lined up for discussing everything about the monk player class, and I'm excited to get into those. I've started talking about and playing the game a lot more in my local area after I moved down to Florida. It took a long time to really meet or establish a Dungeons & Dragons community, and I'm really excited that people I've met are also excited to be trying to create a more unified community around the game, and I'm really excited to be a main part of that. I'm going to be dungeon mastering the first open to the community game that our little group is having this evening, this afternoon. When you're watching the video, I'm probably dungeon mastering at this moment. I'm really excited to jump back in, and I just wanted to share that little thought because I guess it's something that's been weighing on me for a long time, and I'm glad to finally have it taken off of my shoulders a bit by putting it on the internet. And hopefully, the people in the comments, you folk, won't get too mad about it. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, anything that you want to do. I would really appreciate it. It helps the channel. You know all that. You've been on YouTube for at least 7 years now. Thank you again, and as always, stay true. But